This lecture is on the characteristics of Romantic music. Usually, we would go through each of the elements that you already know about when talking about the characteristics of a new period of music. But Romantic music is different from Baroque and classical music, as you've already heard from your listing examples from last week. Much of this music is more complex and more fluid and individualistic. And that's because Romantic music stems from Romanticism, which is a very expressive and individual type of movement. So the characteristics themselves are different. Composers use the elements in many different ways. And so what we can do to identify how they use the elements is give you basic categories of the ideas behind how they use the elements and discuss what they did with the music itself. Individuality was the most extreme characteristic of Romantic music and the most important. But they also used expressive subjects, expressive tone color, colorful harmonies. They used an expanded pitch and dynamic range. They used miniature and monumental forms. They also created music that was nationalistic and used exoticism. Program music was another type of Romantic music that in and of itself is a type of genre of Romantic music, but it's considered a characteristic of Romantic music because so much Romantic music was written that was programmatic. We'll talk about all these different ideas and characteristics of Romantic music, and I'll try and relate them to the elements that you already know as much as we can. So, how did composers in this period use the element? Every single Romantic composer used the elements differently, since they all wrote in different forms. The problem with Romantic music is that it can't truly be defined in the same way that Baroque or classical music can. We've finally gotten to a period in time where musicians and composers and the audience wanted many different types of music and had the power and freedom to create that music. The church and the court no longer ruled what was considered appropriate musically or artistically. So the elements can be used to describe this music, of course. That's why we teach it. Every type of music can be described using the elements of music in their most basic sense. But you can also use emotional language and simple human thought to describe this music, and it's considered appropriate. This music's moved beyond the basic elements into more complex ideas and sounds. So you need more than just the basic elements to describe the music. You need to be thoughtful about it from a human perspective. Now this music is about how elements are combined to create new forms, new colors, new ideas, and new sounds. As I've said, individuality for the composers was one of the most important and most overarching characteristics of this music. It's strange to say, it's almost an oxymoron, that individuality, an individual pursuit, is the common feature to Romantic music, but it truly is, because there was such an emphasis on the personality of the composer, on the personality of the audiences they were writing for. Composing was no longer a family tradition or a trade, a servant path. Instead, it was a lifestyle choice and a career path that people struggled to choose and gave up everything for because they loved their art so much. So, the music that they chose to compose was about their innermost feelings. It was very personal, very individual. Composers wanted to be identified by the sound of their music, rather than write in a form that was already created by someone else. If they did use one of these old forms, they altered it a lot so that it matched their personal ideas and their idea of what the sound of music should be for the Romantic period. Music from this period also used very expressive subjects. What that means is that every composer chose a story, an image, an idea, a mood, an emotion to explore in a piece of music. They loved exploring the darkest and the most joyful of emotions. They would try and describe melancholy with just an instrumental piano piece, or despair in a vocal piece. They also would try and create pieces that sounded like joy or rapture. These pieces of music were so much more emotional than classical or Baroque pieces, and there were ways the composers used the elements to create these expressive subjects in their music. We'll talk about that in a moment. One of the most expressive subjects and most common and favorites was romantic love stories. Of course, it wasn't just a simple love story, but it was a tragic romantic love story, more like Romeo and Juliet, where the lovers were crossed from the beginning and so they never stood a chance. And so in the end, one of them dies or both of them dies. And the audiences loved these stories because they considered them very true to life, very extravagant and exciting. They never knew who was going to end up with a happy ending or not. Composers also liked talking about the fantastical and chivalrous topics because people were obsessed with this idea of romantic love. So they would create mythological stories, or they would set their stories in the Dark Ages or the Middle Ages. They would create music about King Arthur's court and knights in shining armor. Not only did they talk about love and fantasy, but they loved the idea of nature. Music in the Romantic period was considered music of imagery. So if a composer was inspired by a certain aspect of nature, they would try to depict that scene or that aspect in their music. One of the ways in which they would try to create romantic love, exciting stories, nature scenes in music was to incorporate elements of nationalism and exoticism. Nationalism is a type of music created to reflect the pride and joy a specific composer took from his homeland. In other words, many of the composers of this period were very proud to have been born in the specific area of Europe they were born in. Europe was coming together politically at the time, and more states, such as Germany, Austria, Italy, and the Bohemian area of Eastern Europe, were taking pride in their national heritage. So composers would take folk songs from the area, they would use poetry by native poets, and they would incorporate dances, legends, and the history of their homelands into their music. They found inspiration from these national elements and incorporated that into their music by using folk songs or by using the native poetry or the dances, the rhythms of the land. Exoticism is the exact opposite. It's when they would find fascination in a foreign land and its music and art rather than be taking pride in their own country's music. So composers would use elements of foreign lands' music. So, for example, some of the composers traveled into the far reaches of Asia during this period, listened to the music of that area, and then brought back those sounds that they heard. They were inspired by the exotic flair and the excitement of this music from areas such as Asia or Indonesia, and those folk songs were incorporated into the composer's works. Program music was another way in which composers of the Romantic era were able to create music that expressed emotion and ideas and images. Program music is instrumental music that's associated with a story, poem, or scene. In other words, this is not vocal music. Vocal music had words. It could tell a story all on its own simply because of the words it was saying. Many romantic composers thought that this was great and they wrote lots of vocal music, but they also sought to create instrumental music that had the same power as vocal music. So, in order to give instrumental music a chance, they included programmatic titles and descriptions for the works that they wrote without voices. In other words, for example, someone would write a symphony, and they would title that symphony The Rivers of Europe, and then each movement was titled a specific river. In the music itself, they'd try and evoke those 4 or 5 different rivers, and they would give descriptions in the programs that you would receive at the concert as to what each particular movement was supposed to evoke. That's called programming a symphony. This was one of the biggest trends in the popular music of the era. Composers would combine elements in different and new, exciting ways in attempts to tell a story or program for their music. Some of the ways in which composers were able to create these new senses of nationalism, exoticism, and program music were to use things like expressive tone color. This is one of the elements we've talked about in class, but we haven't really talked about it very much because in the Baroque and Classical, tone color was not very common, nor was it expressive. The instruments of the earlier periods were not able to produce amazing tone colors. It wasn't until the Romantic period that tone color became of great importance because instruments were finally solidified in form and expanded in range. And the performers on these instruments were getting better and better able to experiment to create new sounds. They used tone color as a tool to create new sounds and to create more complicated emotional music. Just imagine if you're able to create music that sounds fluid or depressing or anxious, all of those emotions that they would go after, they would try to create using tone color of particular instruments or instrumentations. This gave them access to different moods and atmospheres, which created a much more individualistic type of music during this period and helped to create different forms and musics. They also kept expanding the orchestra size, the instruments themselves, and the range and technique that the instruments were able to create so that they could create new tone colors that would help to tell the stories they wanted to tell and to evoke the emotions they wanted to evoke. Orchestras went from, in the Baroque, being about 20 players on average, into the Classical period being between 40 and 60 players on average, to into the Romantic period ranging upwards of 100 players sometimes. And there were many more professional orchestras, so composers could write for these large, professional, amazingly well-played ensembles, and their music stood a much higher chance of really evoking the stories and emotions they wanted it to. Another element that was used differently was harmony. We've identified harmony as something that supports a melody line. Up until now, harmony has been centered, it's been balanced in a home key that really did support melody. But in this period, composers were busy creating new types of harmony that didn't necessarily support the melody in the same way. In the Romantic period, they were composing music that experimented with strange keys, not being balanced, moving rapidly between different keys so that you never really felt a sense of balance. Instead, you sensed a propulsion to the music and a continuation that was always very fluid and complex. One of the harmony types they used in particular was chromatic harmony. Chromatic harmony had existed before, but it was considered a very bad thing to incorporate into music because it was so dissonant and strange to hear. But in this period, they chose to use the chords that contained tones not found in the key or scale of the piece of music. So they included notes or tones that were unexpected and strange to hear, that weren't in that balanced home key. And they used these chromatic harmony notes in order to create more flow and fluidity to the music. They also used it to create instability, senses of yearning, and tension. And when you're trying to create romantic love stories and tragedies and scenes from nature in which a tempest can come up or the river can be rapidly changing, they needed these chromatic notes, this chromatic harmony in order to create new colors and ideas in the music. Another aspect that's very important to discuss is how they use dynamic pitch and tempo ranges. In the Baroque and Classical, dynamics, pitches, and tempos were all very particular due to what the popular demand was. But in a period where emotion was the strength of the music and individuality was the most common thread to the styles of music, all composers used dynamics, pitches, and tempos differently. That being said, they all did like certain aspects of dynamics, pitch, and tempo. They expanded all of them. All composers tried to expand the dynamic range in particular during this period. They wrote tons of dynamics into the score, not just piano or forte, as you would have found in Baroque or classical music. Now, they would write in 4 or 5 P's and F's to represent the fact that they wanted it to be much louder, 5 times louder than forte, or 4 times quieter than piano. Composers wanted performers to do exactly what they wanted, so they would tell the exact story that they wanted to tell. So they tried to control these expanded dynamics by writing them into the score. This helped to create more tension and release in the music, more emotion, and to build the story. And it pushed performers to the limit of their abilities. It also pushed performers to the limit of their abilities because the composers tried to experiment with widened pitch ranges. In other words, the instruments were getting better for the period and were more functional, so they had a wider pitch range at the highest registers and the lowest registers. Performers had never really been required to play in those ranges of the instruments before because they had really not been developed very well and they sounded terrible. But in this particular period, since the instruments were really perfected, composers were able to write in those extreme registers to create new ideas of tone, color, and sound. And those areas of the range today have become a standard part of the range. Tempo was exactly the same as dynamic and pitch in this period. It was something that was expanded, and it was something that was used to create story and emotion. They would move wildly back and forth in one movement or one piece of music between tempos so that you could have multiple personalities or ideas or multiple voices happening in a piece of music. Music in the Romantic period would converse with itself sometimes. And I think hopefully you heard this in not only the vocal music but the instrumental music that you listened to. Composers didn't necessarily tell one story in a piece of music. They used tempo to tell multiple stories or to move between ideas in those stories. They used something called rubato quite a bit. Rubato was the slight holding back or pushing forward in a tempo, and it was used to intensify or relax music. Imagine when music starts to slow and get louder and louder, and as it slows, it comes to a climactic moment. That's a way that they would intensify music and come to a climactic emotional moment. Or they would push the tempo forward drastically, and that could create more tension and excitement in the music and tell us that something exciting was about to happen. As usual, the last element we're going to talk about in regards to the new music we've been listening to is form. Again, form was something that was very individual, but there were some trends in this period that are very important to know. And the biggest one is that this was an age of contradiction. Composers wrote in 2 types of forms, very different from each other. And when I'm talking about these forms, I'm talking about the more general forms, small pieces of music and large pieces of music. Now that may sound very simplistic, but remember the music we've listened to in the Baroque and in the Classical. Most of those forms of music were quite large in scale. They were written as 20 to 30-minute pieces of music, or they were sets of pieces. So everything was a larger piece of music that lasted for a fair number of minutes. In the Romantic period, composers began to believe in the idea of the smallest composition, the shortest composition, and in the idea of huge, emotionally draining forms. So they used miniature forms and monumental forms. Some composers who loved miniature forms wrote very short pieces of music, 1 to 2 minutes in length. Others who believed the music should be expanded to its greatest potential would create operas or symphonies that would last hours. One composer that you already have listened to created a cycle of operas that was 12 hours long, and people thought that this premiere of those 12 hours of opera was one of the greatest moments in music history. Just imagine going to see 12 hours of opera over the course of 4 days. It's not something that people would normally do nowadays. However, back then it was considered to be the epitome of romantic music that a composer had gone so far with the form of his music that his opera was 12 hours long, or that a symphony would be over an hour and combine the use of over 100 performers. But then again, music in the home was also important, And so you had miniature pieces of music that were written to express one simple emotion or one scene from nature, and those pieces of music would be sold to amateur players in the home. So you had composers working with tone color, dynamic range, pitch range, all sorts of expressive ideas and emotions in the music, and they used the elements and forms to create these stories and ideas. Remember, most importantly, that Romantic music, of course, is individualistic, but in this period, you can almost always tell what Romantic music is versus classical, Baroque, or even the popular music today, because these composers used tone color and dynamics and form in this complex, beautiful, fluid, romantic way that was an emotional way of creating music. So it may have been that every composer wrote in a different style and created new forms of music every few years, but all of this music is considered romantic because the aim of the music, the goal of the music, was to involve the audience in an emotional way and to evoke ideas, scenes, and stories. So again, we have to ask, what exactly is Romantic music and what was popular during the era? Remember that composers were no longer servants. They could be performers and composers. And this was the era in which many composers were not born into the tradition anymore. They simply chose the lifestyle and struggled against adversity and poverty to try and gain standing as a pop star. This was the era in which the pop star was really truly born. This is the era where the idea of the singer-songwriter comes from. And composers had an amazing audience base. Not only did they have the rich folks who still wanted their music and the churches who still needed music, but they had a middle class that was now firmly entrenched in society, that wanted lots of performances and lots of public music that they could bring into their home. They wanted monumental music that was a spectacle, that they could go and watch in a concert hall, and they wanted miniature pieces they could bring home to play themselves. So composers wrote for both venues, and they were able to create amazing careers for themselves because they had audiences that wanted to buy their music and wanted to see their concerts, that would spend lots of money to go and on tickets to go and see them perform and see them their pieces composed on stage. Composers also believed in suffering for their art, which gave a sense of the romantic to the idea of being a composer. Many composers never made it. They died young and penniless, and they just simply were never able to succeed. But the composers that we talk about that did succeed created amazing romantic music, and still, even though they succeeded, many of them suffered and died young because of their art. It was very popular with audiences for the composers themselves to be a struggling artist, rising above to become great stars and virtuosic performers. It was popular to write music for an audience that wanted spectacle and emotion, as well as reaching out to the human soul. And it was popular to write music for an audience that was small and intimate and reaching out to the soul in that way so that people could weep at home or find joy at home and experience the personal nature of music for themselves. So what is popular? Everything is popular during this period. And the idea that a composer struggles for his art and rises above to become an amazing performer and great composer. That was the music that became popular. Those were the composers that rose against the tide and really fought enough and were great enough to create music that has lasted into today's society. Obviously, romantic music's not easy to define, so don't try to define it. I'm not going to try to define it for you either. I want you listening to this music constantly this week and remembering what you heard last week, trying to realize that each piece of music you hear is very different from the other, and yet they're all tied together by this sense of individualism and by the sense of using tone color and dynamics and the other elements of music, including form in particular, to create new and exciting emotion and ideas for musical sound. Audiences wanted it all, and composers gave it all as much as they could and created amazing music that led the way for today's popular music styles. We can listen to and create our own forms of music today at any point and in any way we want, because we've been given the freedom to think of music as a free thing. It's an art that is available to all of us. Are we all going to be great composers? No. Are we all going to be great performers? No. But the Romantic composers and performers paved the way for us all to be given the opportunity to listen to whatever type of music we loved, and to always be open to new ideas and new sounds that great virtuosic performers and composers today are writing.